Although a sizable amount of knowledge on LGBTQIA+ issues has been developed over the last decade, much remains to be explored. And to shed light on mentioned topic, we have some very special guests with us tonight. Now, before I introduce you to our guests, I'd like to give a brief overview about the structure that we'll follow this evening. So, after our guests are done with the discussions, done with sharing their experiences and their personal take on the topic at hand, we'll start taking the questions from the audience. So, I request you to write all your questions along with the name of the person that you intend to ask your questions from in the Google Meet chat box, and we'll deliver it to the speakers. Now, moving on to our guest, I'd like to introduce Professor Paramita Chakravarti. Dr. Paramita Chakravarti is a professor of the Department of English and has been the director of the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University, Calcutta. She completed her doctoral studies at the University of Oxford, UK. She teaches Renaissance drama, women's writing, sexuality, and film studies. Her work in the School of Studies has focused on education and sexuality. She has led national and international projects on gender representation in school textbooks, sexuality education, women's higher education, homeless women, women in the Panchayati Raj, and in self-help groups as well as HIV positive women and children. She has worked with the state government, commission, state and national, and government ministries of education, panchayat and rural development, and HIV control and prevention boards, as well as international universities on policy related to women's education, their empowerment and health. Her book, Women Contesting Cultures, was published in 2012. Her book on Shakespeare and Indian cinemas was published by Routledge in 2018. Her book on Asian Shakespeare is forthcoming. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kaustav Bakshi. Dr. Kaustav Bakshi is Assistant Professor, Department of English, Jadavpur University, Kolkata, a Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow. His doctoral thesis, written with partial funding from the Trust, is entitled Families, Sexuality, and Aging in Sri Lankan Expatriate Refugees, Kinship, Power Relations, and the State. A member of the editorial advisory board of Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, and an occasional contributor to InPlainspeak, the digital media of TARSHI, talking about reproductive and sexuality health in India. He usually writes on post-colonial literatures, queer cultures, and cinema of South Asia. He has presented papers on queer lives and cultures in several national and international conferences in institutes such as Columbia University, University of London, University of Connecticut, City University in New York, European Conference on South Asian Studies, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, to name a few. He has published on queer identities and cultures in several international peer-reviewed journals such as South Asian Review, Post-Colonial Text, New Cinemas, Journals of Contemporary Film and South Asian History and Culture, South Asian Popular Culture. He has a lot. He has done a lot of work in the said field. So at Jadavpur University, Dr. Bakshi teaches courses related to gender and sexuality, apart from the regular courses on English literature and culture. So I invite them both and I welcome them to our fifth and final session. And I hope that all of the students from EFL as well as all the students from outside the university who have joined in our audience today get to know a lot of things about the LGBTQIA community from our speakers today. So, good evening, ma'am. Good evening, sir. Welcome to EFLU's Ensemble. And
Okay. So I suppose you're asking me to talk now. I think how we'll go about this, because we just have an hour. Is probably I'll talk for some time and then Kaustav will, and then we'll take the questions, because I don't think an hour is enough for us to go keep going back and forth. So I think we'll do it in chunks. But if there are any questions, just hold on to them, as the organizers have already informed. and just we're going to answer them all towards the end, just to save time. Otherwise, having an interactive session would have been a better idea, but I think we have a time crunch here. So
Yes, ma'am.
yeah, that's how we want it. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. It's always very nice being invited by students rather than by, old people like ourselves. And also thank you very much for, taking this initiative and talking about, the queer community. But I think the title is a little intriguing. We were not quick enough to give you a title, so but I like the title, as I told Rafi. The Anatomy of Pride, Ways of Being Ourselves. So I think I'll begin by addressing the title and what it might mean, because there might be, it's vague enough, it's general enough, it's innocuous enough for unsuspecting people to think, anything could be talked about. We could talk about Milton's Satan, here, Anatomy of Pride. But what is it? So that is what is interesting about the title, and the use of the word pride is of course the giveaway for insiders. So I think it's intriguing and it's clever. But also, I would like to address this word pride right at the beginning, because of course it refers to taking pride in our identities, however socially stigmatized those identities might be. Taking pride in to be comfortable in our own skin, etc. But also this pride that is associated with the Gay Pride Walk. And I think Kaustav and I both take huge pride in saying that we come from the city where the first Pride Walk was actually organized as way back as in 1999. So Kolkata was again, so there is a special resonance in that. And also the word ourselves, I think that is a word I would like to unpack because it's a very important word, especially where we stand now, divided as we are, distanced as we are. The distancing is an imperative that we must follow, social distancing, whatever that might mean. And I think that is also something we should talk about. So is, who is the our, who is the we that we are talking about? When we are talking about, again, identity categories, which are very often, very segregated, separate, discrete, then how do we forge this ourselves? How do we bridge these identity categories and become a we and ourselves? Taking pride in ourselves, in who we are, and trying to define that we. So I think that's something that we need to address, and that's something I think within the queer movement people have been trying to address for a very long time. So it would be very good, especially at this moment of great crisis, which has been triggered by the pandemic, but which is not caused by the pandemic by any means. It's something which is inherent in the way we practice our identities very often. And I'm not just talking about queer identities here, I'm talking about caste identities, community identities, class identities, all kinds of identities, gender identities. So we need to understand the politics of how to forge this ourselves without losing sight of our identities, how to be ourselves. What does that mean? What is the political implication of that word? Which is why probably, although the organizers have mentioned that we'll probably be addressing LGBTQIA, whatever, which has been referred variously by by scholars as the alphabet soup, which keeps increasing. You add more and more alphabets to indicate identities. Rather than that, I think the word that both Kaustav and I would prefer using is the word queer, which is not just an indication of an identity based on sexual orientation. It's an identity which is based on a politics. And the politics is how we contest, how we challenge the norm of heterosexuality. So it's really something more foundational, and it is really something which can bridge over LGBTQIA, K, whatever, and forge a kind of ourselves. So that is, the larger politics of our discussion, I think, should be really geared towards that. how to look at identity as not something which segregates us into several sort of alphabet categories, but which can bridge over those categories and forge an ourselves. So I think the title is interesting in that, and we should do justice to the title and think about, how we want to interpret that title. Also, if we use the word queer, we would be able to use other categories which are not included in this LGBTQIA string of alphabets, but who also represent non-normative sexualities. So, for instance, single people. And they are opposed to the heteronorm, the norm of marriage, say, of heterosexual marriage. So single people, for instance, sex workers, they are heterosexual, but they are not heteronormative. They don't follow the norm of how couples should live. So sex workers, single people, asexual people. So asexuals are now included in the A of the LGBTQIA string, but also disabled people who challenge the heteronorm in all kinds of ways, and we don't think of them necessarily as queer, but we need to queer the category of disabled people as well. So we need to be more inclusive, and I think we need to really expand this notion of ourselves at a time when we stand more divided than ever by a crisis, which has taught us to, in a society which is already fissured, which is fractured, which is divided by all kinds of categories of caste, class, community, gender, sexual orientation. In that ability, we just talked about disability here. So in a society like that, in a crisis such as we are facing now, these fissures, these fractures are only, deepened. They become much more, and we realize that they were always endemic. For a while it was seeming last year that suddenly, not suddenly, through long years of struggle, the queer community had finally, managed to have the year of the government, the year of the state. So, the decriminalization of 377 had happened. Am I audible? I'm getting a resonance, so I don't know.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Yeah, okay. So just tell me if the audio goes or something happens. So the decriminalization had happened, and then NALSA had been passed much earlier, but deliberations on NALSA had started. There was also these transgender boards which were being set up. The state was talking about reservation of jobs for transgender people. Things were seeming to move towards a recognition of the queer community as a constituency with rights and demands, which the state felt were important enough to be looked at. But unfortunately, I mean, this crisis has really showed that that was perhaps, it just was on the surface. It just seemed cosmetic. There's an endemic sort of fracturing and deep suspicion of the queer community. Not just suspicion, I think it is a kind of marginalization of the worst kind. And what we are seeing now with the COVID crisis is a deepening of these divides, which were always there, which were cosmetically removed perhaps for a certain time, but which have shown up to be extremely real. So we are getting more and more cases of people being thrown out of their homes. Now with the lockdown, there's a loss of jobs for queer people, particularly the precarity of professions. So, for instance, many of them were in sex work, were in begging, etc. And these professions have disappeared almost, especially sex work. And I'm coming to that in a little while. Also, the fact that they are being thrown out of rented apartments, they are being thrown out of families. So whenever there's a space crunch, there's a money crunch. The first victim is, of course, the queer person, the most vulnerable. So we are witnessing this. And in fact, when I was thinking about, this COVID crisis and the queer community, one of the things that I was struck by is that you could almost tell a queer history through a history of diseases and pandemics, particularly the history of sex work, for instance. And I've been sort of thinking about this quite long and hard. And if you consider, for instance, the history of sex work in the last 2 centuries. So the 19th century is defined by how sex work got categorized in a particular way by the colonial state through the disease of syphilis. And I'll just explain how. The 20th century and how sex work gets sort of hugely molded by is, of course, HIV/AIDS. And then now COVID. So it's really sort of the history of pandemics will tell you the history of the evolving category of the sex worker and how we have, changed attitudes, perspectives towards the sex worker. So in the 19th century, in fact, it is the Contagious Diseases Act in the 1860s passed by the colonial state, which sort of established, the category of the common prostitute. Before that, we had tawais, we had baijis, we had singers, we had dancers. There was a whole range of entertainers who did sex work. But this categorization as the common prostitute is happening, the besha is happening in the 19th century, and the context is syphilis and the spread of syphilis, and the need of the colonial government to save their soldiers who frequented brothels, to save them from contracting syphilis. So basically, you curb the mobility of sex workers, you stop them from going anywhere, you put them into lock hospitals, you pass this law, and you regulate their sexuality and their profession entirely. You control it. And it's also very interesting that all of this is being done in the name of public health, public morality. But that public never includes the queer person. The queer person is the threat against whom the respectable society, the decent society has to be protected. Their health has to be protected, and their morality has to be protected. So again, this ourselves is interesting, because who is the public? Why is the public never the queer person? So these are questions I think we need to ask. And just moving on quickly to the 20th century and how the queer movement in India was, again, in many ways triggered. I wouldn't say this was the only trigger, but it was triggered in the 1990s, definitely by the coming of another pandemic, which is HIV and AIDS. And the coming of HIV and AIDS actually both helped the queer movement and in many ways also made it vulnerable. And this dual influence is interesting. And maybe 10 years down the line, we would be talking about what COVID did, to queer identities, queer movements, to the community in general. Because HIV and AIDS, one of the things that it forced us to do, forced the public to do, and forced the state to do, was to mainstream the discourse of sexuality and to recognize that there needed to be public policies in place which would address the question of sexuality, that you couldn't maintain this barrier of silence, and Indians, I don't mean in a very generalized sense, but there is this notion that we don't talk about sex. Probably we just do a lot of it, which is why we have the population we do, but we don't talk about it. So this visibilizing of populations who were never talked about before. So sex workers, gay men, kotis, men who have sex with men, all kinds of hijras, all kinds of communities suddenly became, the high-risk targets, high-risk groups that the state had to recognize to prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS. So on the one hand, a lot of international funding was coming in. This helped the mobilization of these groups. It helped the queer movement in general. But at the same time, we must recognize this, that what HIV did, this coming in of a lot of international funds, also the fact that suddenly these groups became targets of surveillance by the state. Their health checkups were happening, HIV tests were being done, often without permissions being taken, and the complete NGOization that was happening, because a lot of this money was coming through the NGOs, some through the state as well. So the national AIDS control boards, the state AIDS control boards. So, and the minute that so much funding comes in, it divides the movement because not everybody gets funding. And the people who can't attract funding are immediately alienated from the movement. And this happened a lot to lesbians. So lesbians as a group, because they were not considered high risk, people were not willing to give them funds. They got completely alienated from the sexual non-normative sexuality movement, and they tried to align with the women's movement, which was not as welcoming as it should have been. So they felt very left out in that scenario. Kotis became, the group that received the maximum funding. A lot of people, sort of therefore started, these Koti groups. So all kinds of things happened as a fallout of HIV and AIDS. But we are far enough from that moment of the pandemic to evaluate what happened in terms of the queer movement, what the pandemic did to the queer movement. Now that we are in the midst of the COVID pandemic, we don't quite know what it will do to the queer community, whether it will just, devastate it and just, leave it completely vulnerable, much worse off than it was before, even a year ago. Or would it actually sort of help us to forge some kind of new notion of community, new notion of movement? Because a crisis is also the time when people come together. And I have seen, in terms of COVID relief, organizations jumping in and trying to help people, there's also been a lot of politics around COVID relief. We can talk about that, and how the state has always felt that, if NGOs get too much into it, then the state won't get credit, and, NGOs have been kept from providing relief. All kinds of things have happened, and we've seen this all around us. So if people want to ask questions, I have concrete examples, we can discuss this. So there's been a lot of politics around that, and very, very unfortunate politics. But at the same time, one has seen that people have stood by each other. And a crisis is a time when, the movement can be probably revived in a very real sense. Because I think people had become a little complacent, this decriminalization of 377. So we've really sort of, getting really close to the goal, and the state is taking notice of us. But I think that complacence has completely gone. And I think you need that crisis to forge an ourselves. You need that crisis to come together and say, right, nobody's going to help us now, probably. We have to help each other, and we have to form a community which looks after each other. But I am very hopeful, in a sense that, but at the same time, we must remember the devastating effects of it, for instance, on sex workers. I'm talking about this particular group because it is a profession which is, which has been associated with one of the most progressive mobilizations of around HIV and AIDS. So, for instance, in Shonagati in Kolkata, the sex workers movement is still regarded by WHO as one of the most marvelous fallouts of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Because one of the things that happened when because there was a normal sort of condom campaign among sex workers, but what the sex workers said, that unless we help each other, unless we keep saying that, for instance, recognizing that if I use a condom with a client today, and in a street across, another sex worker refuses to do that, then my client will leave, and we will be undercutting each other's trade. We can't do that. We have to come together. We have to all say that no condom, no sex. And that is what they did. And it was one of the most empowering sex workers movements ever. And they got together, and it was an incredible moment. We were part of it. It transformed the women's movement as well, because it suddenly showed what these professional women could do if they put their mind to it, and they were determined not to cut each other's trade out. And they involved brothel keepers so that brothel keepers wouldn't exploit them. So it was one of the most fantastic movements, at least I've been witness to, at that time. I'm not saying that it continues to be in the same way, but it was. And so we also need to remember that in times of pandemics, miracles like this can happen. And one of the, I still remember one of the slogans that we used for Durbar was, I'll just say it in Bangla because it sounds so much better in Bangla, Rastar Merai Pot Dekhache, which means that it's the women of the street who are showing the way. And they did show the way. So I'm very hopeful that, and now with COVID, of course, we have this, notorious Harvard and Yale study, which has come out a month ago, which has said that you need to close down all the brothels. Poor researchers, they don't know that most of the sex work does not happen in the brothels. It's only in 3 states that it happens. It's mostly internet based. It's mostly hotel based. Anyway, I'm not getting into that. So you must close the brothels, you must evict the sex workers, you must teach them other skills, because they are the people who will drive the COVID pandemic, and India will be ruined. Without realizing that it's the sex workers who launch the most successful HIV and AIDS resistance campaigns and acts. So I think, again, the point I'm trying to make through here, and I'm sure that Kaustav will be able to bring in, because he's doing direct work with the queer community around the situation of COVID. I was more involved with the HIV work, so that's the one I spoke about. But also because I see lots of possibilities and parallels. Also because I feel that we need to learn from the HIV crisis and how we reacted to it in the COVID crisis. And this needing to learn also emphasizes a point that I want to end with, which is the need for clear histories. We tend to, in the queer movement, in the women's movement, we are firefighting all the time. We tend to live in the moment. We, as activists, we are, just trying to ward off the clear and present danger. But we also need to look back from time to time and learn from the past. So I think this is a moment where we really need to look back and really need to understand how the queer community, the possible ways in which the queer community can fight back the pandemic. So I'll just stop there and ask Kaustav to talk about his experiences around the COVID situation.
Okay. Thank you, Parmitadi. At the feedback, Parmitadi, if you can switch off your audio.
Sure. Absolutely. I will do that.
Yes, that would be better. Okay, thank you, FU Students Union, to invite us, for inviting us to Ensemble. We are very happy to talk to you. As Parmitadi already said, that it's always very welcoming to be invited by students. But without much ado, I would like to really take off where Parmitadi left off. Why? Because the pandemic is certainly an important, it's a terrible crisis through which we are going at this moment. But if you see that the figure or the figure of the homosexual, which emerged as a sexual citizen subject, emergence of the homosexual as a sexual citizen subject happened as a pathologized figure. Why is it a pathologized figure? Because as Parmitadi pointed out, that in the 1990s, it is to the AIDS Vedbhav Andolan that the figure of the homosexual became a legal category, which had to be protected. And all of that began in the Tihar jail, because within the Tihar jail, it was so happening that it was assumed that men were having sex with each other without using condom, and that had become a sort of a hub where HIV could spread without any kind of protection. So the figure of the homosexual has already emerged within the collective unconscious or the collective consciousness of the Indian subcontinent as a pathologized figure. So the homosexual, if he or she is already a pathologized figure, then of course any kind of situation, a pandemic, an epidemic, whatever it is, it actually pathologizes them even more, to begin with. So I will look at this idea of a pathological figure and how this pathological figure becomes more vulnerable within a pandemic situation. See, if we go back and talk about the queer history, I think you would need like 15 or 16 sessions, and it's an 18-week course at Jadavpur University, so we can't do that. But just talking about the LGBT movement and the LGBT, and there are so many other terms, but I would stick to queer, as Paramita said. That's a term which we prefer, and she has explained why. So let's talk about the pandemic, and let's see where exactly the idea, the title of your talk is like Anatomy of Pride, and you're talking about ourselves. But I would say ourselves, the word ourselves, and everybody who identifies as queer, I think the whole issue of ourselves have been fractured and fragmented beyond recognition now, because the COVID-19 situation has actually exposed the queer people to challenges with which I believe that there was an awareness of it, but I believe it has become much more prominent and pronounced, and it has become terribly difficult to deal with certain situations. So as an LGBT individual, whether how safe you are during the pandemic depends upon where you are located. Where, as in location, means what? Class, caste, country. Which country? Because within a country where you have legal rights, countries where you do not have legal rights. Okay, and medical insurance, the kind of health insurance which your country provides, knowing that you are queer. So if you look at these parameters of being queer, there's so many aspects to it. So the pandemic has made this very pronounced that if you are not from a particular class, if you are not from a particular caste, if you are not from a particular country which provides you with health insurance, then you are leading a rather precarious life. I think 10 days into the pandemic, not even 10 days, 5 or 6 days within the pandemic, and there is a very important project which is going on, which is called the Trevor Project, which is a US-based LGBTQ plus charity project. And they started getting these SOS calls from its members, too many SOS calls, 10 or 12 days. Why? Because as you know that LGBT youth in particular, youth, older people, everybody, I mean, it is a misnomer that it is looked as a youth movement, which it is not. But whatever it is, LGBT people already face, an increased risk of anxiety, suicide, and I would say a disproportionate rate of unemployment, and of course unstable housing. Housing is very important. So all these SOS calls which the Trevor Project people received was because many of these people who were enforced into a lockdown with a family, like a biological family, which doesn't accept them as what they are. So that is kind of creating a new prison for them, as it were. Why? Because for most LGBT people, the biological family, honestly speaking, is not the emotional haven or the emotional support system. For LGBT people, it is a community, which is a greater support system. And because of social distancing, which has now become the norm, the new normal, as it has been very fashionably called, the point is that because there is a segregation from the community, because there has been a distance from the community, these people have lost, I mean, LGBT people have lost what we call that emotional support system. Because within the LGBT, how do you build community? The building of community means building a kinship ties, like kinship ties beyond blood relations, kinship ties beyond the biological family, and you are with like-minded people. And because of social distancing, it so happened that there was a complete loss of what we call community care. There was a complete loss of that, no community care, leading to a declining of emotional health. So you see that ironically, the figure of the homosexual, which emerged as a pathological figure, became more pathologized in this situation. So the problem is that it is going on in a way that there is a decline in emotional health, and therefore they are more pathologized by the pandemic. Next is the loss of community care also, we can extend that to another arena of pathologization, is where gender affirmative care, the idea of gender affirmative care. What is this gender affirmative care? Like for a lot of queer people who are suffering from what we call gender dysphoria, for them, the question of livability, it has now sparked new challenges because uh, they have been rendered most vulnerable. Why? Because this, I would say, the right to life that they have has been temporarily suspended because gender affirmative surgery has been rendered non-essential by the government at this moment, because it is extremely difficult to deal with the pandemic situation, because the pandemic situation is extremely overwhelming. So gender affirmative care or any kind of gender affirming surgery, these are not, in a way, I mean, these cannot be made essential services anymore. So those who are had already been, have already expressed gender dysphoria. I don't call it diagnosis because I don't think gender dysphoria is a disease. It is not a disease. I mean, it is not. We need to understand how it is working. And so the point is this, number one. Number two is, uh, I have been in conversation with a lot of trans men. Now, for a lot of trans men, one important thing is that they were telling me all this while that because of the pandemic, a supply of hormonal injections, the idea of hormonal drugs, which actually help in the process of transitioning, which helps. So that has been completely, it's not available so much. Also, because hormones are not something which you can just buy stepping into a medical store, it has to be supplied. So that supply chain has been broken completely. And also there is an understanding among community members that when you cannot access hormonal drugs, there is a community sharing which happens. Like one friend would share with another friend. So this sharing was not possible because of the pandemic and the lockdown and the social distancing. Although the lockdown has been called off to an extent, it's relaxed to an extent, but the damages which have been done so far are something which we cannot really control now. It can't be controlled. Now, going back to my earlier, what I said earlier, that the travel project, people were receiving so many SOS calls. This was happening across India in various NGOs, and I also got many calls, and there has been a number of suicides during this time. And I would share with you a very specific incident, which was not covered by the media, but it was only covered by one NGO based in Kolkata, which is known as Varta Trust. And it's a very, very heart-rending incident, which you need to understand that how the situation can actually be so terrible for the queer citizen subject. So a Londa dancer who called herself Chanda, and I don't know whether you are aware of Londa dancing. Londa dancing is where boys dress up as women and they dance in shadis and in marriages and in God Bharai and all of these, which happens in very, very many North Indian homes, particularly in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So Chanda was one of those Londa dancers, and because Londa dancing had come to a stop because of the pandemic, because no people could congregate, right? So if you cannot congregate, you could not have festivals. You could not have those auspicious occasions being celebrated. That was not possible. Because that was not possible, so Londa dancing came to an end, and Chanda, that was her only source of income. Because that was her only source of income, she committed suicide. Now, of course, there was no, committing of suicide is not where her tragedy ended. Chanda has been supporting her family with the income she had from Londa dancing. Now, what happened is her family refused to cremate her body. Why did the family refuse to cremate her body? Because of shaming, because they didn't want to be associated with a Londa dancer. Yet, ironically, they were being sustained by Chanda's money. Now, if this is the situation, then you can understand that how precarious queer lives become. Chanda's friends, trans activists, they gathered together and cremated her with police permission, and there was a queer-friendly lawyer helping them with all the other formalities, but her family never stepped in. Also Chanda was kind of saving money for a gender affirmative surgery, which is also known as a sex reassignment surgery. But why? Because her boyfriend, her lover, wanted her to transition into a quote unquote real woman, and even the boyfriend did not recognize that relationship when she died. So, loss of livelihood is something Parmitari was talking about. Let me tell you that this loss of livelihood has happened in such a huge scale that the community has been fractured. When we say ourselves, I am very ashamed to say ourselves anymore, because I am not facing the crisis which my friends are from various other castes and classes and locations. So the ourselves has been fractured beyond recognition. Let me come to the example of transgender women. Many of them have left their biological families long back. And when they left it, they were too young to realize that they should bring with them their voter's ID card, their ration card, later their Aadhaar cards. Many of them did not have any of these identity cards with them. And also, even if they had those identity cards with them, they were identified as male in those identity cards. Okay. So the point is that during the pandemic, when they lost their profession, as in their challa as in challa and badhai, and khajra is sex work, challa is begging, and badhai is going to auspicious occasions and giving blessings to them. So when all of these stopped, the begging at the traffic signals stopped. What happened in the process is that many of them could not also access the food grains which were given by the government, because none of them were registered under the National Food Security Act. Why? Because the government made it sure that if you didn't have a ration card, if you didn't have an Aadhaar card, you could not get your token. The situation was like this, that you have to go to a particular center which has been identified by the government, and you take a token from there against your Aadhaar card or your voter's card or your ration card, and then you take the token and your ration card to the ration shop under which you have the card registered. Okay, the National Security Act, that's the National Food Security Act. So the point is that many of them could not access food grains because there was no legitimate ration card. So I was working with Sampriti Nodia, and we had to really, collect money and send them, because it was very difficult. And when they were actually asking for people for money, and people said that was a fake demand because the government is providing with food grains. But what they did not understand, that this is a very unique, precarious situation for transgender women who could not produce any identity card which the government would recognize and give them the food grains. So you see to what extent that Judith Butler's term, precarious life, the idea of precarity, so to speak, this idea of precarity has been multiplied to unprecedented limits. I believe I actually get very angry when I talk about this, because, and also, the point is, Parvati very briefly mentioned about the transgender boards. The point is that many of these women, trans women, who may be a little more aware because of their, association with NGOs and all, even for them, getting a new identity card based on the fact that I claim myself as a transgender is now impossible, because the Transgender Persons Bill 2019, if you look at it, it as against the NALSA judgment, Transgender Persons Bill 2019 does not allow you to self-identify. There is a lot of gatekeeping which is going to happen now, that a trans person will be identified as a trans person only when a particular board of people, and with no qualification whatsoever, to actually identify them as trans and then give them the certificate. Now this is ridiculous. You can self-identify as whatever you are, but a queer person or a trans person is only allowed to identify as such when the state recognizes the trans person to be a trans person, and I really don't know how they want to do it. Do they want to make them strip naked in front of them and then they were going to pass a judgment on them? I don't know, because the state's understanding of sexuality is so much contingent on biology and not so much about how we understand sexuality as a fluid category, which has nothing to do with the body. I think that is a completely, it's a ridiculous situation here. So no matter how much progressive it appears, like, oh, Section 377 has read down, the transgender persons bill has been passed, if you look into the nuances of it, you would be terrified. It is a precarious life for all of us even now, because this precarity has been multiplied to an extent which we never imagined. Next, and this is very important, like one debate which is now going on is that whether we need civil rights now. A lot of people would agree with that. Yes, civil rights is necessary, civil partnership is necessary. So reading down of Section 377 of the IPC was perhaps only a baby step in identifying or recognizing the homosexual as a viable citizen subject of the Indian nation state. But what about civil rights? People don't have civil rights yet. So in the COVID situation, it so happened that queer couples who are together, think about it, if you do not have civil rights, if you do not have civil partnership, the way medical insurance works, so a couple which is not married, because marriage is of course not on the cards. So if there is no marriage, so a medical insurance, for instance, I have a partner, so and I have a medical insurance, I cannot include him. Why can't I include him? Because he's not married to me. Under what pretext am I going to include him? For instance, he doesn't have the economic privilege that I have to maintain a medical insurance, a private medical insurance, and he doesn't have it. So if he is affected by COVID, then I would not be able to use my medical insurance to, pay his bills at the hospital. So without civil rights, you can understand that this kind of conjugality is not possible. So it is very different from how a heteronormative family functions. So the COVID-19 has made this extremely pronounced that no, even if you are recognizing the queer as a legitimate citizen subject, you are not giving them enough rights to survive. These are rights to survival, these are right to life. But none of these are provided to the queer citizen subject, it's not available to them. More importantly, this has happened, like, you can say that, well, these health emergencies can happen anytime, then how is it so specific to the pandemic? It is specific to the pandemic because think of this. There is lockdown all over the place, okay? And this lockdown is intermittent now. It is not like continuous, but even then, mobility is terribly restricted. I'm giving you a situation. For instance, I'm staying with my partner. My partner is affected by COVID-19 and my partner's family doesn't know about it. In the hospital, it is extremely difficult to get your partner admitted because you are not a legitimate signatory. You can say, I'm a friend, but that's it. I mean, why would you recognize yourself as a friend? Why can't you say you're a partner? You cannot say you're a partner because immediately when you say that, there would be another level of pathologization, another level of, phobia, which is going to emerge at that moment. It is extremely difficult to get your partner admitted, and you cannot really call the family to come in and sign those forms, and they cannot travel all the way. So you have to work around tactics to get your partner admitted to a hospital, so you can understand what would happen to queer people in a COVID-19 pandemic kind of a situation. Going back to where it all started, like the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s, which percolated down to India in the 1990s so much. And then that pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic, the fracturing which has happened all over the place, I mean, in the 90s and today. So the idea, just going back to this, that when we call about ourselves, and you used a medical term like anatomy of the bride. So if you look at the anatomy of the bride, you will see that there are too many wounds and too many, scars all over the place. And I'm really not sure that how those can be addressed at this moment. And it may take us another 10 years to realize that how this pandemic has harmed the community, how it has fractured the community beyond, recuperation. So with that, I'm going to stop because I believe I've been able to give. Yes.
Okay, can we have the questions now? Hello?
Can we have the questions now?
दवाई कैसे कैसे खाना है सब लिखा हुआ है बता दो अभी खा रही है
Hello.
Yes, ma'am. I think the audience needs a little more time to frame the questions. I'm not sure what is happening, but so about the discussion that we had this evening, this was a very, very thought-provoking session that we had. I'm sure I personally understood that it is indeed true what Dr. Bakshi said, that the issue of ourselves, the topic of ourselves has indeed been fractured and fragmented, and we'll be able to understand what has happened to the community.
The audio is trailing off. I can't hear. I don't know about Kaustav. I don't know about the rest of the people.
Hello, Shivani.
It's very difficult to hear anything. I can't hear. No. Yeah.
Shivani, your audio is trailing off. I'm so sorry for the connectivity issues. Kaustav sir and Paramita ma'am, thank you so much for the very engaging session that we had today. You both pointed out a lot of things that are really not taken up by the mainstream media when it comes to the matters of HIV and how things have been. That is how we talk about things that have been. We don't talk about it as much as we do, as much as we used to now. And especially when, as mentioned about how various things on paper, when it is put into practice, it doesn't really benefit the people who are really suffering. So thank you so much for those things, bringing it to our notice. Let us go for the question sessions. Please drop your questions into the chat box, along with whom it is addressed to. There is one question from a user called LearnPlex. This is directed at Kaustav sir. Sir, can you please suggest some topics for writing proposals on the LGBTQ theory?
LGBTQ?
Theory.
Topics. There are so many. I mean, well, it's... I don't know, like, what to say. I mean, of course, you can wait a little, speak to a number of people who are going through the pandemic at this moment, and could be how the queer movement has been affected by the pandemic here, and that would require a lot of ethnography. I believe you have to be in touch with a number of people and do very extensive interviews in order to understand, speak to NGOs, speak to people who have been very badly affected by it. I mentioned certain professions like Londa dancing. I've mentioned professions like Challa, Badhai, and Khajra. Parmitali talked about sex work. So the kind of professions with which some trans people or Koti men are associated with, that could be one way of looking at it. It could also be certain places like, understanding couplehood, queer couplehood at the time of the pandemic. So that could be one way of looking at it. But it depends upon the spectrum of queer is so large, it's so indefinite, that it is extremely difficult. I mean, I believe that to give you some suggestions, and there could be many, you can write to me and I can give you suggestions, because you also need to do a bit of review of literature, because lot of things have been already written about LGBT issues. So you write to me and I'll give you certain suggestions.
Thank you, sir. There's another question to Paramita ma'am. This is from Aina Bhattacharya. She has asked, can you please talk a little more about how sex workers have been affected during the COVID situation?
Yeah, certainly. Because I've been working with Durbar, from the beginning of the pandemic. Now, of course, the whole point of any sort of intimate contact, people have lost professions. So, for instance, even hairdressers or beauticians, masseurs, people who do massage. So all of these, professions which involve direct contact, and of course, sex work, has been affected in a way that perhaps other professions haven't been. So sex workers have been completely, for even in March, they were reporting that nobody's going to Shonagachi, and people are really avoiding it. Now, what has really happened in brothel-based sex work is, and these, as I said, it's only in Delhi, Maharashtra, and Bengal, where you have large brothel-based sex work districts. And here, the women, 60% of the women have just left. They've gone back to their villages. We don't know where they are. They're not contactable. They've given up their phones. So it's a really scary situation. And they had come together in such wonderful ways during the HIV/AIDS pandemic. We've really sort of lost touch with them, and we don't know how they are managing. Again, there's a lot of suicides, probably even starvation deaths. We don't know, because along with the fact that they don't have a livelihood, it is that they can't go back to any other livelihood because of the stigma. So it's not as if they can take up any job, because they've already been branded as a kind of Shonagachi woman. So for instance, they can't take up domestic jobs, domestic worker jobs. So nobody would have them. So it's been, we've been talking to Azad, the driving people who teach women how to drive. It's really difficult because of the stigma. So it's not as if they can shift professions. It's not as if they can have alternative professions. This profession has become unviable for them. We don't know for how long. So it's really a terrible situation. And on top of that, now we have this study coming out of Harvard and Yale, which has all the sort of authority of Harvard and Yale. Yet it's not even peer reviewed. It is based. They are saying they've done 500 interviews. How have they done these 500 interviews? We are being unable to contact the sex workers. How have they done the interviews? I really don't know. And based on what are they saying that, close down the brothels? The brothels are closed down. They're not operated anymore. So evict them, teach them new skills. I mean, all of this is so easy. So I don't know. I mean, that study has done more damage than we can imagine. So yeah, it is a terrible situation. We don't know when they will regroup. It's not as if sex work is not happening. A lot of it is happening on the net, virtually. A lot of phone sex is happening. A lot of I think flying sex workers who are individual operators, they are doing sex work, taking huge risks. So those kinds of things are happening, but the thing is that brothel-based sex work, I think, is finished. Really, I mean, I really feel that.
Can I add to that a bit? Yeah, the point is, okay, so although when we talk about sex workers, as in women, many Koti sex workers and trans sex
No,
workers.
That's what I said right at the beginning, that
Yes.
a lot of the queer community is engaged in sex work, and they don't necessarily identify as sex workers, but they are engaged in sex work, as indeed large parts of whatever respectable society are.
Very difficult to document their predicament. Very difficult, because it's a decentralized kind of sex work which happens. It's not brothel based. So it's very difficult to document. We would not be able to document it. There can be 2 or 3 interviews which you could do, but not more than that. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. So this is our 5th session. We had a session on the 16th called Raw Wound and Silence Ties. It was our 3rd session. And in that, Dr. Gogu Shyamla, she is a Telugu activist and author. She did mention a lot of these things, especially when it comes to the traditional Devadasis, how they are also sidelined in this current pandemic. So it is something that is not really addressed as much as it should be. So thank you for detailing on that. There is also another question from the same person, Ina Bhattacharya. She has asked you, Paramita ma'am, can you please elaborate a little more on how lesbians were sidelined within the women's movement in India in the aftermath of the AIDS epidemic?
Yeah, I mean, because they were not considered a high-risk category for the transmission of HIV and AIDS. Many of these organizations did not receive funds in the way that other organizations who worked with Kotis or MSMs or gay men did. So as a result of which, they felt kind of not part of that whole HIV/AIDS triggered. But as I said, it's not just HIV/AIDS, but a lot of that came from the funding. The mobilization happened because of the funding, and they just fell completely out of it. as a result of which they sought other kinds of alliances. And very often you would groups. But again, as I said, I mean, women's groups were not necessarily very sympathetic or welcoming of them either in the early days. I mean, it's different now. So, for instance, if you take an organization like Sappho, Sappho's relationship with, say, Protoy or now Varta, what was the Sathi? Yeah, would be much more tenuous than its relationships, say, with the feminist network, which is called Moitri. So, so the alliances became different. So instead of a queer alliance, you then have a women's alliance, which is based not on sexuality, but on gender. So what I'm saying is that, the politics of funding then shapes how alliances are forged, how the movement goes ahead, things like that. I hope I'm making sense. Otherwise,
Thank you, ma'am.
write to me or call me.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question from Shalini Chakravarti. She has asked both of you to speak about the perils of asexual people, especially during the COVID times.
Asexual people?
Asexual.
Kosa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, a little bit of it. Shalini ki amader student, I guess so. Asexual Visibility and Education Network. Shalini, I would like you to refer you to that. Asexual Visibility and Education Network is that body which is dealing with the, as you mentioned, perils of the asexual community at this moment. The fact is, I don't think it is so related to the pandemic so much, but the point is that asexuality has been integrated within the LGBT movement, and I think in 2010, in the San Francisco Pride, I think that was the first time when asexual people actually came on board. But there has been a segregation from the larger LGBT. Okay, again, going back to the idea of the anatomy of Pride, there has been a bit of a segregation from the Pride, the LGBT Pride, because the asexual people now have a different kind of flag. So, and the color in that flag which represents asexuality is black. So it is not the rainbow color, which because black as in absence of all desires, but not in a very negative sense. Because asexual people are not aromantic people. Asexual people are capable of falling in love. Asexual people are capable of romantically associating with each other, but maybe they are not interested in perhaps by the physical act of it. So I don't think, of course, asexual people will have their own problems the way the LGBT community is also going through it. One good thing which has happened in the last 2 years is that 2 or 3 years, we have seen a lot of popular cultural of asexual people. I would refer you to the Netflix series Sex Education, and you will see what I mean. So asexuality is now becoming more inclusive, but also the asexual community is also segregating from the LGBT community, so to speak, which is sometimes identified as hypersexual. And within the queer community, asexuals are also queer, but the point is asexual people are also marginalized within the LGBT community because people refuse to believe at times that they couldn't possibly have sexual desire. They consider it as abnormal once again. So even within the queer community, the asexuals have suffered a lot of oppression. And that's why this segregation, this political segregation which has happened. So you check the Asexual Visibility and Education Network website, and you will see how it is being updated almost every day. Asexuality.org. Asexuality.org. I'm giving you the link here.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. Also, the fact that if you look at the Indian queer movement, we have very little representation in terms of asexuality and very little research as well. So I just feel that that really needs to be done, and there's a lacuna there. So yeah, otherwise, Kostab's pretty much covered it. So, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. There is another question to the both of you regarding asexuality from Shamu. He's asking, do you think that the conscious act of not doing, in quotes, presents itself into even a greater area of trouble? The act of sex, if not done, is lauded throughout the society, but only till one particular point. I believe if someone asserts being an ace, let's us even after marriage, hell would break right. What do you think about this double paradox?
I really like this question actually, because on the one hand, we talk about the silence around sex, right? And it is almost preferable if nobody talks about it, nobody does it, nobody thinks about sex, etc. But it is also considered, a procreational duty. So I'm talking about sort of social construction of sexuality. So I completely sort of get your point where you're saying that asexuality is almost lauded because it's and again, if you look at Indian traditions, especially spiritual traditions, this whole idea of celibacy, which is very powerful aspect of Indian spiritual traditions. So brahmacharya, for instance, brahmacharya, or for women even, celibacy of the widow, for instance. So all of this is seen as a kind of spiritual, and then if you look at how Gandhi looked at sexuality, again very, very complex. But asexuality is definitely, again, the question is, I don't think it is. Celibacy is really about feeling sexual desire but denying it. Not giving into it, whereas asexuality is not feeling sexual desire. So I think those things are different, but they are often perceived similarly. So I think, we have this extraordinary sort of social understanding of sexuality, where on the one hand, no expressions of sexuality are seen to be the marks of a good person. Because sexuality is also seen as something which makes you partial towards one subject, So the person you're having sex with, of course, which is why if you look at the way in which our nationalism is constructed, it's very interesting actually, if you look at our political leaders, this understanding, and this is including Gandhi, there is an understanding in which if you choose the country, you cannot choose one sexual partner, because then you become selfish. And Gandhi talks a lot about that. So this idea that brahmacharya is related to loving your country, so you transpose or dislocate your sexual desire elsewhere, is also very interesting, which is why, he said that women should come into the movement. He preferred widows because they didn't have, again, they were practicing celibacy anyway, and they were wearing white, so they looked very good in terms of the nationalist movement. But of course, he rejected sex workers very clearly because they were practicing sex. So again, the practice of sex and celibacy and the social premium, the spiritual premium that Indian cultural traditions place and spiritual traditions place on celibacy, nationalist traditions, all of these go into this making of this paradox. I love this question, and I'll think more about it, but I've just tried to open it up a little bit. If Kaustav wants to add something.
Yeah, I think it's also the idea of chastity. The idea of chastity, which is very central to the nationalist movement. And the more chaste you are, the more acceptable you are within that political scenario. So I believe these three, celibacy, asexuality, and chastity, I think three can be brought together. But the relationship is not too linear, actually. It's a little complicated. Yeah, but it's a good question. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next question. This is from Devabrata Sardar. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. The question is, since the identity of a queer person does not relate to the body and is entirely related to mind/emotion, which does not have clear visibility, what are the ways to battle this problem? It doesn't say, the person doesn't say who it is addressed to, so either of the speakers who are willing to comment,
I don't know the question. The queer person's queerness is not related to the body. Is that what is being said? I don't see it.
Even. And then the question says how to address the problem.
I don't understand the question. Could you read it out again?
Since the identity of a queer person does not relate to the body and is entirely related to mind or emotion, which does not have a clear visibility, what are the ways to battle this problem? If the person who asked the question could maybe more elaborate it, please kindly do that.
I think also it relates to what you were saying about transgender people. And the fact that when you self-identify as a woman, it doesn't mean that visibly you have to look like a woman always. But at the same time, a lot of transgender people also take on visible markers of traditionally understood femininity. So it is not as if, it is not about visibility, visible markers. It is only about the mind. It's not exclusive like that. I think what Kaustav was saying, and Kaustav can elaborate this, but if I get your question, you need to understand. I mean, it's not a need to understand, but I think what Kaustav meant was largely, and I think I also referred to that at some point, that queer identity is really not about sexual orientation always. It can be a political position. Just as queer identity is not about visible markers always, it can be an emotional identification. So if Kaustav wants to elaborate on that.
Well, I think I said this earlier also. Like, it's not about and it is not a problem to begin with.
Yeah,
I think you mentioned the term problem. It is not a problem. What happens is
it's a choice.
It's a choice, and yeah, it can be a problem when the state is not too willing to accept people based on fluidity. The problem lies with the state, not with the person. I mean, I can be a gender fluid person, but that doesn't mean that, I have to be concretely carrying a marker, or I want to pigeonhole myself as something in order to be understood as a sexual citizen subject. But the state wants to understand me or give me rights based on a marker, a very concrete marker, which is related to the body and not so much of the mind, because your psychological disposition is not visible. So they are more into visibility and concrete markers. So that could be a problem. The problem doesn't lie with the person. Yeah.
I hope the question is answered to your, yeah. The next question is directed to Paramita ma'am. This is by Reeswal Chatterjee. Ma'am, can you please talk a bit about the situational difference between the AIDS pandemic and COVID-19, which is affecting the sex workers?
I think there's a huge difference in terms of how the state is reacting as well, and the rest of the world. So when the HIV/AIDS pandemic happened, I think the state did not respond immediately. What happened was there was a lot of international pressure for the state to respond to the pandemic, because of India's huge population, international organizations felt that India would become one of the greatest vectors of the disease and would spread the disease. And also, it is important that HIV/AIDS was seen as, the whole impulse was seen to be coming from the West, although, of course, Africa was the sort of site of it. And here, of course, it's seen as a South Asian crisis. It is seen as something that is coming from China, which has a different kind of geopolitics associated with it. The state here has responded well. I have no words for the response of the state. You know best what the state did and did not. But here, of course, because the whole world was involved in a way where Europe was not spared, HIV/AIDS was a crisis that affected only some people. And it's very interesting, Susan Sontag, in the 90s, she wrote this book called Illness as Metaphor. It's an excellent book where she actually sees the AIDS crisis as something which returned us to conservatism of a certain kind, because it emphasized the need to be monogamous, the need to practice safe sex, not to be promiscuous. It, in a certain sense, stigmatized the gay community even more, because these are the people who carry the disease because they are risk takers. And she said the whole sort of gains of the sexual revolution of the 1960s, we have lost now, because, now everything that all that people want are church weddings and a career in investment banking. So she sees the HIV/AIDS crisis, in India, it actually opened up the sexuality discourse. In the West, probably it shut it down in a different kind of way. So I think these are very different. The 1990s was a very different time geopolitically, as well as in terms of what it did and where the queer movement was at that time. So in our country, the queer movement hadn't actually taken off, and it's with HIV that it does. So it's a very, very complicated question. I mean, which has, and of course, we have a very different state now. We have a very different international configuration now. We also have a very different point in the queer movement now. Also, a very different relationship of the state with the queer community. So all of that would actually make these differences, very stark indeed. And I think we are still in the pandemic. 5 years down the line, we'll actually be able to evaluate what it really did or did not do.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for the question. The next question is by a user called Andronicus Aiden. So it's an open question. Platforms during the COVID crisis assist in establishing a sense of solidarity within the queer community, or does it reveal the fragmentation within the queer community stemming from difference in class and location? This is an open question.
I couldn't hear the question. If you could just...
Yes, sir.
Whether the COVID crisis, probably I'll just shorten it. Andronicus is asking whether the COVID crisis actually deepened the digital divide or helped to close it. I mean, did it forge links between the queer community or did it open up these fissures?
Okay.
Yeah. I think the digital divide affected all communities. I don't think it's specific to the queer community, but I think in the case of the queer community, loss of connection, as Kaustav explained, means and has implications of a kind that, it doesn't for other communities. And I think even for the women's movement, I mean, what we've really lost, and I can say this because, this is something, one is we've completely lost the anti-CAA movements. We have also completely lost our older comrades because they are not good with technology. We have also lost, and of course, there's a class divide. So apart from the class, there is an age divide. I mean, people who can't handle, this kind of technology are completely and have huge experience in terms of the movement. We are losing them.
Yeah.
Of course, I want to add.
Yeah, particularly queer people with disability. I mean, they have been affected the most badly because of this, because they are not equipped to handle all these, digital platforms. They are not being trained. Who is going to induct them into doing that?
Yeah.
So if you bring in the aspect of disability into queer, you would understand where the divide has actually happened. So, of course, it is not about being on Instagram or Facebook. It is much more than that now, right? So, for instance, we are on a Google platform. So I don't think it's very disability friendly, not yet. So yeah, there are differences, of course, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
and the movement is suffering because of that. So
yeah.
Yes, even when physical spaces are not really exactly disability friendly, the virtual places still a stranger to people like them. Is there any other questions? Okay. So this is the fifth and the last session of Ensemble's. It was a literary gathering by the EFL Students Union, and we had a very good run. Started from the 8th of August to the 9th, and from the 16th we managed to cover a bit of topics. We are not sure that we did cover everything, but we started with a digital publishing topic, and then we went around being around poetry, where we have where we had K. Daruvala, K. Sachidanandan, and Dr. T. Vijay Kumar. We had Suhail Mathur and Samyukta Nair. We had Raghu Shamla, Tesa Pandit, and yesterday we had Dr. Dibyajuti Roy and Juhi Girl. I would like to invite our Students' Union President to conclude the series and thank the two wonderful speakers we had today. Hello, Anthony.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
And see you as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. First off, I want to thank both of you for this incredible session. I guess yesterday when Dinil asked me to talk today, I was wondering what I should say to the student community, because it's been a long year. We've had a pandemic. We have had protests. Natural disasters hit us daily. We've had a lot of struggles that we've all gone through, and it has affected us in many different ways. I wouldn't blame anyone if they lost a certain kind of hope all throughout the continuous battering. But today, when I saw all of you gathered here to talk, if in my heart, what I felt was this is what hope looks like. This is what hope actually looks like, in the sense that even when we are down in the dirt, when we don't know where we are headed in the future, there are people who come together and talk about it, to share in the feeling, to be your fellow human beings keeper, to actually get down to the core of it. And I felt that this is basically what a humanities education is all about. It is a fundamental pursuit of hope, to help and be helped. And that's essentially what I would like all of our students to imbibe from these sessions. It was the spirit with which this session and all the previous sessions were created. I hope that in the future, all of you will continue to do good to everybody around you, irrespective of race, caste, creed, culture, gender, no matter what situation your fellow man is in. Please, from the bottom of your heart, please try to help them. Please try to understand them. And that is what a humanities education is all about. And I hope all of you will try to imbibe what we learned here in the past few sessions and try to make it the most out of it in your everyday lives. That's basically all I want to say. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony.
And there's one more thing I forgot. I want to thank the team that put all of this together under Dinil and the counselors from the Literary Studies School. Uh, this wouldn't have been possible unless you put in long hours of work, sleepless nights to gather information, to contact people, to put it all together. And I'm indeed extremely grateful for every single second of effort you put into it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much. Um, Really, thank you for the really good, enlightening, and really interactive session to our two speakers, Dr. Kaustav sir and Dr. Paramita ma'am. The feedback form has been dropped in the chat box. Do kindly fill it without error. And thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.